All right, welcome everybody. This is the first ever New Visions podcast, episode 1, coming to you live from the Society of Illustrators in New York City. I'm John Lee, part of the New Visions committee that's chaired by Jonathan Bartlett and also has Jensen Ekwall and Yao Xiao on it. And we're here to talk about contemporary illustration topics and issues and things that need addressing in our industry. So first of all, I want to thank everybody for tuning in. Big shout out to all of the RVA crew that's in the live chat right now. If you guys haven't, please check out the previous talks that we had, the Stories Matter podcasts, also on the Mixler and also on YouTube through the Society of Illustrators. This particular podcast is going to be a continuation of that particular conversation, and we're trying to be a little bit more detailed, a little bit more nuanced, and hopefully we can have a really engaging conversation that is more targeted. So today we're going to talk about illustration education. So this is a shout out to all the 2016 graduates. You guys are all out there going to the real world, and it's a scary place, right? Like, it's a really scary place, but hopefully your education has prepared you for that, or not. And we're going to be talking about a lot of that stuff. With me are my gracious and my intelligent and beautiful and talented guests who have a broad and wide variety of experiences with education. We have current students, recent graduates, people who have been teaching for a while now, and they're all professionals and they're all working currently. So hopefully they'll, I don't want to talk for you guys. So maybe I'll just go around, kind of introduce yourself, whatever you feel like the world needs to know about you. So, Cynthia.
Okay. All right. Hi, I'm Cynthia, and I am going to be a senior at Maryland Institute College of Art, Micah, in the fall. And I'm the current student.
I'm Marcus Cheng. I am a freelance illustrator in New York. I'm originally from Toronto, and I also am an adjunct instructor at SVA.
Hi, my name is Kakeda. I'm a freelance illustrator. I currently teach at MFA at FIT, MFA Illustration at FIT, and I'm originally from Japan.
I'm Annie Bowler. I'm a recent graduate, just graduated this week from SVA's MFA illustration program. And I have a very strange educational background. I did a little bit of health sciences and medicine. I studied philosophy for a while. So I bounced my way into illustration, and now I'm here.
Great, and I'm John Lee. I'm Annie's classmate, actually. We just graduated on Wednesday, which is crazy. But I'm also a freelancer, and I've taught as well at the undergraduate level. So I'm kind of a bridge between our two experience levels here. So hopefully we'll have a good talk. All right, so I'm just going to throw this out here, kind of give a little prompt in terms of like how we're going to steer the conversation. So with the New Visions kind of, especially with the Stories Matters talks, we're talking specifically about diversity and inclusion. And those are like some pretty buzzwordy words, right? Those are like the buzzwordy words. You know, people like to talk about the diversity at like, you know, in back rooms at Google and in banks and wherever. But they are at the forefront of a lot of our conversations. You know, think about stuff that went on the Academy Awards and Hollywood right now, to even like who's getting published in poetry journals. Like, everyone's talking about these things. Because for better or worse, multiculturalism is one of the defining aspects of our generation. And we have to address it, not only as a source of, there's a lot of like historical injustices, but also it's kind of a blueprint for the future moving on. If you think about the demographics of just America changing into a minority-majority country, right? So today we'll talk about specifically how it affects us as illustrators, designers, and educators. So just like a few little, I guess, definitions. I think generally when people talk about diversity, they talk about race, gender, and sexual orientation. and that's really just what diversity means. People try to talk about like we need more of the diversity. They don't really understand what that means, I don't think. I mean, when we talk about inclusion, we're just talking about how do we include, accept, and support those people who may have been historically excluded from various systems, and maybe taking a small step towards normalcy of diversity as well. So what do you guys think specifically, I'll just throw it out there, about not just diversity and inclusion, but the conversation about diversity and inclusion in illustration or within education? Like, just give any general thoughts of how you've dealt with that conversation in the last, maybe just like even the last year or so.
Well, I know at SVA, we kind of, I feel like our group, our cohort of classmates kind of fell into the conversation. I'm not sure that it was actually brought up at all by our faculty members or anything within the program. I feel like because of the diversity of our backgrounds coming together, that we sort of brought up that conversation. So I'm not sure what other people's experiences are in the classroom, whether there's a formal discussion of it or whatnot. But from my experience, and I'm not sure if you agree or disagree, John, it was really up to us to decide we wanted to explore that as a cohort, which I think we did sometimes well and some other times less well.
Yeah.
I know in my experience, I mean, I haven't been a student in, like over 15 years. So trying to think back of what it was like as a student, those conversations never happened, diversity or inclusion. And I went to school at OCAD-U. It wasn't called OCAD-U back then, Ontario College of Art and Design University. It was called OCA, Ontario College of Art in Toronto. But we never had those types of conversations. My friends and I, my classmates and I feel like for us, our main concern was just to learn about illustration as, the craft of creating images. Mm-hmm. And in teaching at SVA, also, as Annie was saying, it hasn't been formally brought up within the classroom, even though a lot of my students are of various, ethnic backgrounds. So yeah, but, there have been some instances where some of the work that's been shown might allude to the student, the student's ethnicity, even sexual orientation. Believe it or not, it's happened in one of my classes. So, but formally, no, it hasn't been discussed, in that capacity.
Yeah, for me too. I went to Savannah College of Arts and Design in Georgia, late 90s, and went to MFA Illustration at SVA in early 2000. But Savannah, at that time, the school was pretty small, so there were not many international students. So I don't think it was so diverse as a college, but in the classroom, we never formally talked about it. And also at SVA, like, we didn't have chance to talk about that, or like I didn't have a personal experience that I felt discriminated or anything. But of course, teaching at FIT, I see a lot of students who are international from diverse background, and their project sometimes could be it's all about their personal voice, so it'll have some sort of voice about their culture, their own culture, and things like that. But yeah, in the classroom, we don't talk about.
I feel as though, definitely a lot of the work that deals with diversity is very self-initiated by the students. I think it really depends on the conversations that are being had, like at the school, on the campus, and within the city, or within media. I feel as though I've seen a lot of these conversations. Of course, not like the majority, but there are definitely students creating work that are based on things like culture, gender, sexual orientation, just examining themselves and examining how they occupy the space that they're in. And I think it's happening more and more as like diversity becomes more prevalent in just topics in media, in common common conversations that we have. Being in Baltimore, we had the uprising, and that definitely inspires a lot of conversations about race and power and equity. So I feel as though as we kind of as a society move on toward talking more about race and what makes us different, I think education also needs to adapt to be able to help accommodate these students who want to talk about these issues in their art.
So was that so what you were talking about, was it cross-disciplinary? So it was just illustration, maybe like fabric arts, or not fabric, material arts and design, painting, etc.
Yeah, I think there's definitely all around like the campus, conversations are being had outside of the classrooms and within the classrooms, and students who feel personally affected by the events have created some pieces. And
were your professors helping to facilitate a safe space for the students to be able to like express that and connect it to their work?
I think it really depends on the people, like both the students and the teachers. They're I think all across the board, there's some teachers who might be more understanding depending on where they come from and like their level of understanding. So I think that also successful conversations about these sort of pieces that might talk about these sort of issues are also dependent on like your classmates and how well the educator can lead those conversations.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too because part of the reason that this particular podcast is about illustration education, and as I mentioned to you guys in the email, there's been a broad cross-section of American universities, even private institutions, art colleges that have had protests on campus, protesting various things from the racial demographics of the faculty to the curriculum, like what things are being taught as canon in art history. So we had talked briefly about how RISD had protests in April, but that's like one of many from VCU to Yale to Mizzou to there's all sorts of every school in the U.S. basically has felt the impacts of this, which I think it goes back to what you're saying. It's academia is not outside of that. We think of academia as being this kind of like insular thing that is, I guess, buffered by the effects of the real world, quote unquote. But I think this is kind of borne out that like this stuff does affect students, faculty, staff alike in academia. So just real briefly, I kind of wanted to talk about the demographics. So we talk about like this stuff really anecdotally. So there's a few numbers that I think is really interesting. And it's kind of, we talked about it briefly in the last Stories Matter podcast too, where so 8% of art graduates make a living as an actual artist. This is from BFA, MFA, PhD.com using the US Census data from 2009 to 2011. 17% of those actually got into education and teaching, which I think is interesting. In New York City alone, New York City is 33% white. 74% of the people that are making a living in the arts with arts degrees are white. So there's a very large discrepancy there. And New York City is 23% black, but only 7% of the artists with art degrees are black. 29% Hispanic, 10% artists, 13% Asian, then 10% actually become artists. Then the American Survey of New York City from 2010 to 2012, 55% of artists working are male, even though only 42% of those with art degrees are male. And another little sobering demographic from the National Endowment of the Arts is that in 2011, women artists only made 81 cents per dollar earned by a male artist too. And then, for every single illustration encompasses so many different industries from textile design to websites to publishing or whatever. But I think publishing is actually a really good example to shine a light on specifically. This is from the Diversity Baseline Survey in 2015, publishing staff from 34 major publishers and 8 review journals. It is 79% white, 4% Black, less than 1% Native American, 7% Asian, 6% Latino, and 1% Middle Eastern. It's also 21% male, and 78% female. And amongst the executives, it gets even worse, right? It's 86% white, so it's a very majority white industry. So I think data tells a story that is kind of irrefutable in terms of how we talk about this stuff. But, the demographics of art schools are changing. Like we graduated on Wednesday, and I easily, like 35 to 40% of the students were Asian. they're broadly international, and there's just a lot of them. But then I see that, but then I look at who's getting the actual work, and then it's kind of like, wait, what's going on here?
That's funny.
So what do you guys think, like, about the demographics of your schools, or the demographics of your classes? Do you guys just have any thoughts at all about that? It's kind of anecdotal, but still.
In my teaching experience, most of my students, there's always been exceptions within the year, but most of my students have also been Asian from, different.
And a lot of female students.
And a lot of female students.
Yeah.
But again, I think I don't want it to be like a blanketed statement too. And it's also because of the class that I taught.
Mm-hmm.
So, and this is going to sort of fall within sort of a stereotype, but I taught fashion illustration, and that appealed to women,
Right.
And within that classroom, there were a lot of Asian females, mostly from Korea and recently from China, so.
The program that I'm teaching is very small. It's a MFA program, and it's about 13 to 15 people. And I think the director selects diversity, like in diversity. So we have usually like 50% female, 50% male. It seems like I've only been there for 4 years. So during this time, and also 30% international students. So there's diversity in culture too. But when I go to other school for like guest speaker, I see a lot of female students, which is, I feel happy, about it. So I feel like, in 10 years, illustration, it could change the percentage-wise. The working illustrator could be maybe 50 female, 50 male.
Well, what was really interesting when I was in school, when I was in school in the 90s as well, mid to late 90s, I graduated in 99. First of all, my illustration classes were very small compared to, I feel like illustrations turned into this like completely different thing.
That's
When I
true.
was studying illustration, I called it the dying profession because a lot of my teachers who I had, and even the guest lecturers, they talked about how much money they used to make, and a lot of them weren't even working in the industry. And in my particular class, there were actually only two classes sort of running concurrently alongside each other, mostly men. Off the top of my head, I think I can think of 4 women who were in my class. That's nothing, But and it was mostly in terms of the ethnic, the breakdown of ethnicity, mostly Asian and Caucasian. That's it. That was the demographic when I was a student, and as a teacher, it's flipped. Mostly, women, mostly females, are in my class.
Yeah, I feel like our program, I was talking to our director of operations, hi, Kim, if you're listening, yesterday.
We love Kim.
Everyone loves Kim. I was asking her some, she didn't have any like hard statistics, but just she's seen a lot of classes come into the MFA program, and she says they do all of their selection without having, they maybe have a name, so they could potentially get a gender from that, but otherwise they don't know until afterwards. And she said that they've had years where it's mostly men, but more recently it tends to be more females apply. She said it used to be a lot of Koreans, and now it's a lot of people from China applying. And she read down the list of the people that are accepted for the incoming class. And yeah, she said that it usually works out to be fairly diverse, which is interesting because all they're looking at is the work. So I thought that was interesting, and then made me think about my other educational experiences, one at a small liberal arts college and then the other at UPenn in Philadelphia. And SVA is by far the most diverse classroom setting that I've been in. I think part of that probably has to do with studying illustration and the arts instead of philosophy, which is the study of white dead men, and then the sciences, which is interesting because that has a different, that sort of just detaches itself a little bit from cultural conversations. But so I don't know. I think the MFA program is fairly diverse if you're just kind of looking at at the demographics, and then I'd say our group pretty diverse in terms of where people are coming from. At least in comparison to my philosophy studies, which were my philosophy of race class was taught by a white person.
But it's funny you're saying that because when I was in school, I used to think of illustration just as that. It was a celebration of, straight white men.
Really?
It was an all boys club.
Interesting.
And I know it sounds mean, and but that's just my experience.
Yeah.
And it's only been in recent years that I've seen a change in terms of, and even, as a gay Asian male, I always, I think entering the industry, I sort of felt emasculated by the work that I was creating and putting into the industry because, what I liked was fashion and lifestyle illustrations, and I was creating these images that didn't dialogue with a lot of the illustration that came before it, decades before. And so I kind of, for me, it felt very strange to sort of be in this environment. But again, in recent years, I felt things really change, such as this conversation.
Yeah, the irony of it is we're sitting here in the library at the top of the
I know.
I mean, you walk up the staircase and there's all of the past presidents and everybody.
Yeah.
It's like Norman Rockwell and Dean Cornwell and all of these guys that are like the established canon, quote unquote, of American illustration. But now things have really tipped to a point where we're having this conversation next to all of their drawings and stuff.
Yeah, when I was in school in late 90s, there were an unspoken understanding of if you're a female illustrator, well, you're gonna be a children's book illustrator, and no way editorial kind of thing, but also the faculty that I had at the time, all the female faculty were either children's book illustrator or fine art artists. So, I mean, we didn't really have other information, and now I see Yuko Shimizu and Jillian Tamaki, Ellen Weinstein, so many editorial illustrator who are successful and female. And I think, and nowadays there's internet and everybody can get to see those people's success. And I think that's kind of now we have female artists to look up to, for younger generation.
So at Micah, do you have the same perception in Micah, or I feel like it's a very unique perception of, even just like SVA in general, like SVA is kind of a unique case in terms of being in New York and having the makeup that it does. I know that's not true in a lot of art schools. Like RISD has been 1% black since the 1960s. And like that's been a constant kind of thing. So it's kind of, that makes me pause, you know. And I know a lot of art schools in the US that are not in such a cosmopolitan area, they kind of have these problems trying to attract, or even just like letting these people in a lot of ways, letting more diverse students have access to it. It just seems like an impossible feat for them to accomplish, even though it should not be at all, right? So at Micah, like, do you have kind of that perception in terms of who's coming to school there, who's teaching, the visiting artists that you have?
Yeah, there's definitely only, looking around at my classmates, there's only a handful of non-white and non-Asian students, and which is weird because we're in, like, Baltimore is a black city, and, like, we have so few black students. Faculty, we have very few full-time faculty. I'm sure it's not too different for adjunct. We have very few people of color. And then, so, like, who is, then we have, like, some educators who, become our, like, token diversity person. And then, then that's a big responsibility, right? To take for a single person on campus, or not a single person, but just like, there's only a handful,
Right.
And then so it's also in terms of the students, who, like, where are we looking, like, where are we advertising and trying to recruit students? Is it overseas? Is it, like, why isn't it happening more in our very own community, in like our own city? Are we creating opportunities for those students who don't have the privileges and accessibility to go to such an expensive college? I think students, seniors, recently initiated a scholarship for Baltimore City students so that they can have access to becoming a Micah student, which, financially it can be very difficult. So shout out to those guys. Good job.
Yeah, I think the economics of it definitely, it's almost a whole nother conversation in terms of, higher education in America and the access to those resources. But it may be just the byproduct of a small, like, art school. Like, it's best to target people that can pay in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
There's like a weird cutthroat kind of
but then at the same time,
capitalist to it.
That's true. Like, but then is that, like, that's also in its own way, like, just kind of discriminatory, or like, just, I don't know. We just if we think that they can't, afford it, I don't want to. That's but then then there should be opportunities to be made, especially if, like, a school wants to create. I feel like there's a lot of times where, like, these small art institutions can feel very distant from the communities that they're in, and just, like, I think it's so important to try to strengthen those bonds between community and schools, especially, like, I think it benefits the students too. Like, how much are they interacting with the community? Are they staying within their campus and not getting out there and trying to learn from the new environment that they're in?
Yeah. There might also be, talking about whether or not people can afford to go to art school, there's probably also a disconnect in terms of the practicality of a degree in art. And I had no idea what illustration was until I was 28. And then I thought that if I was going to study art, I was going to be a fine artist. And that wasn't what I wanted, so I thought I'd do something else. So I think that potentially when we're talking about getting involved in communities, and again, I think SVA is a bit odd because it's in New York and it's impossible to not have New York all over you when you leave your school, just to go, home. But it's introducing this is illustration and this is how you make a living, and having practical, introducing high school kids or younger to the fact that you can have a career in the arts that doesn't have to be based on fine art or gallery. I don't know enough to talk about those experiences, but I think that might also help in terms of, okay, I'm going to be a first generation person in my family to go to college, and it's okay for me to study something like illustration or design that can provide me a career in the arts that does have an income and can have stability to it if you create that life for yourself. And yeah.
I only know about Japanese culture, but but for like for Japanese people, if you're a male and say I'm gonna be artist, your parents gonna just kill you.
Cry.
You know, they're like, why can't you be doctor or lawyer? And if you're female, it's a little bit easy.
Okay.
Because they're like, well, she's gonna get married anyway. It's not gonna be her profession for the long run, right?
That's funny.
So I feel like there is some sort of cultural things too that is it okay to be artists? Can we make living? Like what would your family say? You know, like all those things also, like if your family doesn't have money, it's really hard to choose a path that you're really not sure you're going to make it.
And also, I think as, you know, for the individual too, who's considering, let's just say, you know, because like my background, I come from like the lower part of middle income. So the thing is, for me, not coming from a family with not a lot of money, I wouldn't even consider certain schools. And I know there's scholarships, and you hear these like stories of like these, you know, students who, you know, feel less than or come from, you know, like, you know, more sort of conservative means, or limited means, who, you know, attend, you know, these spectacular schools. Not saying the school that I didn't go to was spectacular. I love OCAD, you know, woohoo. But my point is that, you know, that wasn't my first choice. My first choice was that I, you know, like Annie was saying, I didn't know illustration existed as a career. And when I did, but I knew I wanted to draw. I knew there was such thing as art college, art school, but I wasn't sure if that was something that I could do because, you know, how I was raised, how my brain was, you know, wired was that, you know, you come from a family who moved here to Canada and, you know, and your parents, you know, work really, really hard and it's your job, your legacy to them to do better than them. And so it's not going to happen by you being an artist, you know, so it was kind of this like twofold thing. My parents didn't want me to pursue art, but then I think I didn't want to do it either, you know, and I didn't go to OCAD. That wasn't my first, you know, that wasn't the first school that I went to. I went to a school called York University, and I actually did apply to the fine art department and I got in. But the only reason why I went to York is because I got a really, really small scholarship for a few $100s. I went there. But when I was there, I was still questioning whether or not I should pursue it. And so I was on my way to transferring to a business program within the university. And then, you know, it didn't work out. So, but that was a long-winded sort of.
But what was the turning point? Why did you decide to go to
Because I was
illustration?
Miserable. Yeah. And it was like teenage rebellion.
I mean, so I kind of did have a money segment, so I might skip ahead to it since we're on the topic already. So, you know, in illustration, education, and every illustration department has like a professional practice type of class, or there is an aspect of it that hopefully kids learn before they get out in the real world. Do you think that those are perhaps geared towards a more economically mobile student? And also, when you have these old school professors that are like, oh, back in my day, you know, I fell into a job at the New Yorker, blah, blah, blah. I became art director, you know, because I was running coffee for somebody back in the 60s.
Yeah.
Those paths don't exist, A. But then B, a lot of these students, if we're talking about these ethnically and racially diverse students, you have like female students, etc., like they literally cannot follow the paths of, say, these older straight white male professors. So do you think that the professional practice of illustration education actually is relevant now, or is it perhaps in dire need of retooling?
I haven't gotten to that point.
Everyone's looking at
I'm just like,
Cynthia.
oh my guys, I haven't taken that class yet.
Well, I feel like now there's more diverse way to promote yourself.
Sure.
But are they being taught these new ways?
Well, having a website or blogging or maybe social media.
I think a lot of it is like a lot of students are kind of running around like, oh,
Yeah,
get out
I
there.
know.
And like we want to like we see I think a lot of people we see are like the people who make it big online. And so I think there are a lot of students trying to follow that path. Like there's a lot of young people who gain popularity through the internet. And then like that's who we see, right? That those are the people in our lenses. And like there's not quite, comparing it to other industries, I guess, there's not quite as many like internships per se.
Right.
And then, like how do you find yourself breaking into that? A lot of people just kind of, from my experience, take on like a part-time job and then keep making art and just hoping that, sending out things and then trying to get noticed.
Because I know Annie, we just joke like we would get in the elevator and it'd be like postcards, man.
Yeah, like the whole graduation thing just happened, so it's like my entire family's here. It's like, what's the plan? I'm like, well, I'm gonna mail a postcard with my art on it and wait. And I mean, we had a business. Well, yeah, I'm going to do it later. We did have a business boot camp class, and I feel like we touched on the promotional stuff a couple of times in a couple of different classes. But a lot of the stories we would get, and one of the benefits of SVA is being in front of, all these legendary people and great storytellers. But a lot of those stories, like John was saying, were rooted in, an older way of things being done, knocking on doors or calling, somebody every day every Friday, until they gave you a spot in the New York Times. And that doesn't seem like it exists anymore. So I feel like the big takeaway, I don't know, I would love to see it expand a little bit more, to be more than just, okay, we're going to send postcards or send emails. And also, we have here, we're in New York, which is great, and we can see each other's faces and meet all these people. But for people that are maybe a bit shy or introverted, or international students that maybe don't have a mastery of the language yet.
Like me.
I can see, I'm always really intimidated at the American Illustration Party and all that stuff. And those are actually opportunities where I feel like that's a lot of the promotion stuff is introducing yourself to people and meeting other illustrators. And I could see how it's challenging for me, and I could see how it would be even more challenging for somebody else. And so, I don't know. I definitely think that it could be, the discussion about how to be an illustrator could be expanded.
It would be interesting to listen to people who have been doing it for like 5 to 7 years,
Right.
illustrators who have been working, because I used to teach a business of illustration class, and I quit because part of the reason that I quit is, I was teaching a couple of classes, but another reason was, so I couldn't manage it in my schedule. But another reason was that I wasn't sure if what I was doing was relevant anymore in terms of promotional stuff. Because I do send out postcards, but I'm, at a different place in my career where I've already, created this body of work. And so the postcards are just kind of supporting it, It's just kind of like a high. Yeah. And I've met a lot of the people who receive these postcards and about American illustration. I've been to a lot of the illustration events. So I think it's received differently, but if you're just starting out, I don't know if it would work or have the same kind of impact. So
I have a few, like every semester, I have few young illustrator coming in, and their promotion tactic is same as I know when we started. It's always maybe instead of postcard, they'll be sending more personal materials like zines or like small product. But other than that, it's like mailing promotion, and sending like an email promotion.
Yeah.
It seems like that's how they start also. So it hasn't been really a change, I don't think.
I think God bless you, Marcus, for realizing that. You're like, my gosh, do I really know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, well, that's the thing, yeah.
Because I feel like a lot of, and this is really no offense to any of the teachers out there, but a lot of people lose touch and they don't really know what they're talking about anymore, but they retain those positions and they're teaching these kids about their experiences that may or may not have any relevance towards the industry today, right? So, one thing that I had written down was like, I had a couple students in Memphis. So Memphis is like, it's not New York, obviously, and it's in the Mississippi Delta, and it pulls from Mississippi and Arkansas and Western Tennessee. So there's a lot of working class kids, which is great because art school gives them, Memphis College of Art gives them the opportunity to go to art school, basically, which is great. But at the same time, the institution in and of itself did not support working class students very well. It's like, oh, you gotta have like all this mat boards and you had to like frame all your stuff and like buy plexiglass and you have to buy this gouache and it's like
Those
it's
postcards
only use that
free.
gouache. But there was a lot of that stuff. It was tailored more towards like an economically more mobile student, and a lot of those strategies just were completely irrelevant to like a working class student who was working 3 jobs just to like pay to go to college. So I would love also to see the professional practice aspect of illustration kind of encompass a lot of these different socioeconomic levels as well.
Yeah.
Do you guys like have any experiences like people, your classmates or like maybe students that just couldn't afford something or like they were trying to make it work but they just couldn't, and then you're just like, this is what the syllabus says, I don't know.
Well, I've never taught like a material class, so I've never had to tell students to, you have to buy acrylic or like this and that. My students just bring what they have, I guess. I don't know. I know maybe undergrad is different because I remember when I went to school, undergraduate, they did have a syllabus with you have to have 5 different colors of acrylic, this and that. But I don't know. I'm out. It's been not so long. How is it undergrad now?
It's. I think it's still pretty similar. I've received like materials lists that are as long as like a letter size paper, and I just usually ignore them until I have to buy them. I'm not gonna buy like all of these things that I know I'm not gonna use as an illustrator later on. And I know like there's this group Free and for Sale on Facebook that students use all the time, and we sell everything at a discount. And a lot of like art supplies are, like people will sell their unused art supplies that they use like a pea size of like paint for their foundation class, and then like they don't use it, later on, and they sell it. So I mean, I always think that's like my favorite resource in terms of like buying and selling used items. Like that's really great that students have created that space for themselves.
That's great.
But it's so expensive.
Also, digital illustration are so in now, and those things cost money, like all the pads.
Yes.
And
then they break, and then
does the school undergrad or graduate offers that kind of
do they provide it for free?
No, like they have a lab that you can go, or
there are those things. There are like labs and things, but like hours are always limited, so times that they're open and things like that. So I mean, there are ways of getting around it, but it's not like the most convenient.
Right.
Yeah.
Back to like the business class promo stuff. See, part of me is also thinking too, like, in terms of self-promotion as well. I think a lot of it has to do with not doing something once and then expecting an immediate response. I think, unfortunately, it is about the continued, sending out a postcard. I'm laughing. I'm just using that as an example, but also, it's supported by so many other things, such as now, social media, and then also I don't know, a blog. Am I being like, now I'm dating myself? People don't.
No.
Okay, blog. But you know what I'm saying? So it's like, and meeting in person, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So I think, it's kind of, I wonder if, these kind of business classes, it's not necessarily to give you one way of like maybe promoting yourself, but maybe to give you a start of ways that you can do it.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I'm not sure if I'm being sort of articulate about it, but I'm bringing it up because alongside of my illustration, I'm also, I took a year off last year for sabbatical, and I interned for a couple of fashion designers. And in my experience there, it made me become really interested in wanting to collaborate more with some fashion designers and do print and textile designs. And so nobody in the fashion industry really knew my work. And so essentially, I was sort of brought back to square one. And so how am I going to get my work out there? What am I going to do? And yes, I did postcards / books, but that was my first thing that I did. But another thing that I started to realize is like a lot of it's about personal connection, and it sounds really kind of old school, maybe old fashioned, but I really believe in that. I really believe in, the events like American Illustration Society of Illustrators. When you go there and you make the first connection, that person might not remember who you are. But, when you meet them again, when you send them a promo and that person receives your promo and they, before they may have maybe thrown it away, but when they receive it the second time, it kind of injects life into this like inanimate object, and there's like, oh, this is from Cynthia. It's not just a card with a picture on it. Yeah. So I don't know. I really believe in the value of personal connection.
Yeah. I while we're on this topic again, I do want to like talk about how there's a lot of these opportunities of meeting people face to face are in like New York and like these big cities. So like, what happens to those students who don't have the money to like buy a bus ticket and go all the way? Sorry, not to go back to money again, but just like, I just always think about how it feels like certain locations can benefit those students who are in those locations. So then if like those people are restricted from going to like those big conferences or conventions where they do meet people, then what do they do? I feel like then for those people, their only resort is the internet or things like that. Yeah, and when we talk about postcards, it's so surreal to me, like, because like I don't use mail anymore. Like I've sent one postcard in my life maybe. Like, so I'm just like, do people look at postcards that go in mailboxes?
God,
like,
I just printed out 500.
No, you guys have more experience. I'm sure they do.
I'm so old man, right?
Well, to go back to that point, Cynthia, and also something you said, we were kind of talking earlier about Micah in connection to Baltimore. And having the art schools and then art students and the professionals that come out of art schools be connected with their communities. I think the need for like socially responsible artists who are at least conversant in these topics and know what's going on and know, if I draw something a certain way, then that's maybe kind of offensive, that I probably shouldn't do that. I can. That's like completely within my right to do so, but like maybe I shouldn't, right? So what do you think that art schools really are preparing these kind of like socially engaged students? Because like this conversation is not just happening in illustration and design. Like, again, like I was talking at the beginning, it's happening at the largest like Fortune 500 companies right now. They're all talking about how do we solve, quote unquote, this diversity and inclusion, again, quote unquote, problem with this millennial workforce that's coming in. And I think like with illustrators too, especially if you want to say you want to do editorial illustration, you have to be really in tune with a lot of these issues and understand them and bring a level of nuance and experience to them. Do you think, I don't know, like in your classes, Marcus and I, do you guys really stress the conceptual, like you really have to think about what you're putting out in the world, because your images have power, right? And you have responsibility to make sure that power is targeted in the right way. So what do you guys think about that?
In my class, it's come up. I co-teach, last year I co-taught with Chris Buzzelli, and it came up a couple of times in some assignments, and we talked about accountability, and when you put your image out there, it can be read in certain ways. So just be aware, of your intention, type of thing. And it's we usually catch it around like the sketch stage, and then, but there isn't usually a huge discussion. It's usually, like we just sort of shed light onto it. A few years ago, it was really interesting. I had a female student in my class, and she had created, my fashion illustration class, and she had created a series of work that was about female African American empowerment. And it wasn't, the approach wasn't done in, I guess, like in traditional illustration type of way. There are some abstract components. Maybe some of her concepts were, it didn't have an immediate read, but that was the root of her content. And she's African American, and I remember one particular crit. Another one of my students had brought in an image that contained a blackface, a black racist stereotype, archetype, and I remember there being a hush in the room, and I think a lot of us, and she wasn't doing it. There was nothing malicious going on. It was just, what happened, because, yes, that's just what she brought. But it was really interesting because it was near the end of the class. Other students had other classes to go to, so we couldn't really talk about it. But it really bugged me because I felt like it needed to be addressed. And so I remember going back to the studio and bringing this up with my friends who I shared a studio with. And the advice that I was given, for that particular situation is, bring it up, talk about accountability, why maybe it could be perceived as wrong. But don't look at the student who, let's just say the African American student who was creating this body of work to celebrate women, to empower women, for her to be the ambassador of, and I thought that was a really important thing to say, to acknowledge, because at that point you don't want to single out anybody because nobody did anything wrong. But at the same time, you need to at least plant a seed and acknowledge that, it's illustration, it's the art and business of communication, but at the same time, it's not just about making images. When you put your images out there, they have some kind of meaning that could be interpreted in certain ways, and we have a responsibility about it. So,
and it is nice to have a classroom full of like diversity, because you never know, like, maybe you're offending somebody, but if it's a classroom full of just one racial or like, it never comes up because.
But even like drawing, for lack of a better expression, like the chinky eyes, to represent Asian people. It's like...
Do they still do that?
Well, I mean, I've been working for like 14 years and then a student as well. So, within that time, I've seen it,
Right.
So,
wow.
That it sounds like you handled that situation really well, and thinking
not
about,
by myself, with
but that's
some
but
help from friends.
But yeah, again though, like realizing that you felt unprepared in the situation, and then getting counsel, because we discussed. I feel like John and we discussed a lot of these things in our class, particularly in our writing class, which didn't have any visual component to it. And so that's where I feel like what you did, and bring it back to talking about the work and grounding in the work, because that is the one thing that everybody in the room has in common, that we are visual artists trying to tell stories with pictures. And in our experience, or my experience, that I'm not sure how you felt about it, John, that we lost touch with that part of it a few times when dialogues came up, mostly about gender roles and the representation of women, and how they were being described as being powerful, but represented in a way that some people felt like wasn't conveying that. And I think we really missed an opportunity to really attach to the visuals in that situation that came up in our class. And it's not to fault our professors because it's very, it's real time, it's happening. And, it made me think, and we had dialogues about it afterwards, about the responsibility that you have. You're not just drawing a picture and then calling myself out for, okay, if someone's telling me to draw a family, am I drawing a heterosexual white family having a picnic? Or why am I choosing these things? And I feel like it was our classmates kind of bringing that up, but I could have learned a lot more from it if we kept anchoring it to the pictures and to the making of the work, as opposed to the theoretical. You're in the workplace now, and we had one teacher who just kept asking us if we would do illustrations for the NRA every week. I was like, maybe, I don't know. But
the answer is yes for $2.7 million.
Yeah, exactly. Because it was always for an ungodly amount of money. But that it was I think there was an honest attempt to have these conversations, but they were separated from the work that the class was bringing to the table. So
it's funny, as an instructor, I'm guilty of not bringing up these topics in class. So for an editorial classes, your original question, no, we don't. I've never purposely, brought into this class, discussions about these particular things. And as a student, it's never been brought to me. It's always occurred in the way that Annie just brought up, through experientially, through people's personal experiences. And then that just sort of rolls into another thing. But similarly, when I think I was in grade 11, and I loved art back then. And I remember showing my paintings to a guidance counselor / English teacher too. And she's British. And she said to me, she's like, why do all the people in your paintings, why are they all white? And I was like, oh, I don't know. I didn't realize it. And then, from that moment on, I started to, be more aware of, the ethnicity of the characters in my work. Not sure how that relates, but what you said kind of just spawned that thought.
So I always think how can educators bring that conversation into their assignments, because I've been also noticing that these sort of conversations are very student initiated, and I think it'd be a good challenge for as this conversation becomes increasingly relevant, how do our teachers start create assignments that have students reflect on who they are, and how they feel about these sorts of topics, and then that will move on to hopefully create healthy conversation, and they'll be able to think more critically about these conversations.
Yeah, because one of the the prevailing, and also from going through the SVA MFA program, the real prevailing thread that runs through it is the idea of the personal voice, right? It's your personal content and what you're trying to say, but also how you're saying it and the hand that you bring to it as well. I think that's a great and noble idea, but then I think a lot of the instruction sometimes falls flat in terms of, say I draw a certain figure and then in crit somebody says well, why isn't it Asian, or it's not Asian enough, or there's some kind of perception of how it should look, and there isn't this kind of it's not letting me just tell you what this is going to be. This is my personal voice. Let me figure it out. And there's efforts to steer it one way or the other, and those conversations don't really occur. Whether that's because there's some kind of blind spot on the educator's point, or I don't know, but I think that example of you realizing that if you put somebody on the spot, you're tokenizing them. There's that level of that hypervisibility that a lot of minority students feel too, where it's I feel constantly I have to do this certain thing because everyone's looking at me to do it, and they have this idea of what it is already. On the flip side, there's that idea of invisibility, right, where it's nobody's talking about Asian stuff. Or if I put up a Japanese influenced drawing and nobody has our historical context of what that actually means, they can't talk about it, and so the crit just goes silent, right? So yeah, I think I would love educators to have to be able to tackle these problems, because I think they're just going to get more and more complex as there's more international students coming into the workforce. A lot of our friends, they have work in China and in Asia and in Europe, and people are working all over the place. So you have to be able to tackle those issues as they come up, I feel.
Well,
Yeah.
go ahead. I was just going to say to the the theme of the program being the focus on developing the personal stories, like we tell stories, and I think that's really important. But one thing that it is also important to realize the context of your personal story as it relates to those that are around you, and that this was same as at my liberal arts college, really focusing on developing each individual student to their own potential, but sometimes I think that can be, if you don't also develop the ability to look outside of your personal story, that can fall short. And I'm not sure if that's what you're referring to, John, that there could be more effort put to this is what you're doing and this is your voice, and you need to be able to defend your work and speak intelligently about it, and also recognize that it does impact people that are not you. Even if it's your personal journey, other people are going to be impacted either positively or negatively by it. Sorry, what were you saying?
No, I was just thinking about my class that I'm teaching, because it's about personal voice and developing your artistic voice. So, like in the beginning of the class, I would give assignment according to like starting from learning who they are as a person, and that includes backgrounds, of course, their culture, who they are, or like childhood stories. And yeah, I don't want to, like as I was listening to you, like, oh, I don't want to give assignment that like are too like putting them to their ethnic background and stuff, but it is kind of part of the path of finding out who you are as an artist too, to know who you are. So it's it's a difficult thing as an instructor too, that like what's the boundary of asking somebody about their background,
because it could feel really confessional for the student.
Right.
It can be really tricky.
Right.
I feel it's like having advised MFA students, I feel like it's easy, more comfortable, because it's two people having a conversation. That intimacy allows for trust to develop, for vulnerability to be exposed or to be revealed, and the sort of those two things help build stronger relationships. But within a classroom that's people from all different backgrounds, some of whose English might be better than others, some are who may be shy, and others who are more extroverted, all of a sudden it's a lot more challenging to have these conversations. And in my experience, a lot of these conversations happen after class, where it can become a sort of one-on-one or 3 people, 4-person discussion, but in the midst of it, the classroom, even though it can be a safe space, it can feel like a stage, and
So a lot of these things, we're saying that they occur outside the classroom. You're saying even like you sell books to each other on a Facebook group, and I know a lot of schools have like, say, the Black Student Union or these student organized groups that tackle these particular issues that whatever these students may want to discuss. But in almost every case, it's not actually supported institutionally by the school, right? And like these topics that we're talking about, they're not codified in any kind of instruction. And is that weird? Like, Annie, is that how like things? Is that how school is supposed to work? Like,
am I the expert on school?
Like everybody is winging it at all times. And these topics are so big that like I feel like we shouldn't be winging it. I don't know, like.
Well, I think the discussion, I mean, in my experience, I'm definitely not an expert on school.
Glasses off.
Professorial, roll up my sleeves. But it's not that, I think these issues are they're not new, but the conversating about them is new, and the power I think that young people and students feel, partially because of the internet as a platform, means that students are mobilizing more and kind of forcing. Whereas when I was in undergrad, it didn't exist. Facebook had just started. We couldn't connect as easily. These conversations were not happening at the liberal arts school that I went to. They were trying to start, but it was very much like, here's an effort and it's yay big, and there's not the program that they had to help diversify the student body, which was majority white, had the students coming from urban areas to the college in the summer to do some prep class so that they would be prepared to start. And then they got to go home for a week, which was the week that we all came and did orientation. So it just socially divided. It made no sense at the time, but there wasn't really any dialogue about it. So I forget what your question was, but I don't think.
Yeah, I'm just saying, like, in art school, it's like, it's like Hogwarts. It's a totally unique thing in and of itself. I just am wondering if it is tackled any differently in larger universities that have more resources.
I think Hamilton, which is the undergrad school I went to, was pretty small, and so it didn't, it was doing it was called the HEOP program, and then there's another program called Posse. I don't know if you guys have heard about it, and it takes groups of kids from urban areas, high school kids that excel, gives them full scholarships to 4-year schools, and it's called Posse because they send them in 10 to 15 numbers so that they don't look around to a sea of there's people that share their experiences at the college environment so they can succeed. And Hamilton had that program. I was looking it up yesterday to prepare for this, and they have a long list of colleges and universities involved, and there's not an art school in there, so I thought that was interesting. At Penn, it's a bigger school, and I wasn't in the undergrad, so I'm not quite sure. I think because of the fact that I was in a sciences program, that changes things. There isn't, science is science, and there's not really there wasn't a cultural conversation happening there. There was attempts to reach out to the Philadelphia community, but I guess no, it's not better outside of the art school bubble.
Yeah, I mean, it's just kind of interesting.
Mm-hmm.
But do you think it's an art school, or are you asking within illustration? Because I feel, and I'm not trying to separate fine art and illustration and commercial art, but I'm only bringing it up and I don't have much experience within fine art, but I feel, the very, 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 very small experience that I had was like a summer program at SVA, like the summer residency through a fine art program through the fine arts department, and also at Cooper Union. And that was like years ago. And I'm bringing that up because I feel as though, first of all, it was really international. It was a super intense program, but what happened is because people were coming from different parts of the world and wanted to say different things, they said it through their art. So they weren't given assignments, and I felt as though like there wasn't also this kind of at least when I went to school. It seems like there's this kind of trajectory that you need to sort of follow as an illustrator. You finish school, you create a portfolio that sort of appeals to book or editorial or advertise, like things like that. There's like that kind of a function, and so within that kind of work is, I feel like it could be really challenging to bring up these types of topics within assignments. Not saying that we shouldn't, and not saying that you're saying it should be codified within this particular institution, but I felt like within my experience in this sort of fine arts setting, people had a lot to say about, their own history, their culture, et cetera, gender, sexual orientation. It was just much more open, because what they wanted to do with their work after that was continue that dialogue. It wasn't that they wanted to get another editorial job or do this job or that job. Right. They had a particular story or vision or concept that they needed to express and dialogue with what was happening in the world around them. So yeah, I don't know. I think it's really tricky, because I wouldn't know how to. I love the question. I wouldn't know how to do it within in illustration
Right.
context. I don't even know if context is the right word, but maybe someone else does. Maybe someone out there knows, because I think it is an important, talk to have. Even in your program, the MFA, SVA, some students, have created projects that, have an impact socially, that impact the community. And they've, one of my former advisees, Ryan Hartley Smith, he had created this guidebook. It was beautifully illustrated, but it was for LGBTQ youth who were coming out, who lacked resources, who may have been from a small town. And, he had created this book for one of his projects to help these young people not feel so alone and to have access to information. But that wasn't, SVA didn't tell him to do it. It sort of was, informed by his own interests and the things that he cared about. So, but it's just, I'm sharing. So, yeah.
No, I mean, because Marshall Arizman, he always says, like, it's best if you're making the work that you want to make and you kind of trick people into paying you to make that work. Because he always tells that story where the only thing I knew how to paint was like guns and like dog-headed things, and cats and stuff, monkeys, and it worked out, right? But then there's a caveat to that where he's saying that you don't have to inject all of your personal content into every single assignment, right? You can, there's bits and pieces. I can give 10% or 20% or 30% or whatever, but you kind of have to know where that line is, I feel like. And a lot of illustration education, like, I feel like turns a blind eye to that when it is so focused, like you say, Marcus, on like book or these genres and these industries or whatever. You get really tied up in the forms and less about the content, but then I think maybe you suffer as an artist, perhaps, just in terms of knowing your own practice, that it doesn't lead to the heights that it probably could have. I don't know.
You mean if it was to be more focused on the content first and then fitting it into the form?
Yeah, I feel. And then it's up to the educator really to develop that within each student. And again, that kind of goes back to the conversation of like, how do you do, like, is that teachable?
I don't know. I feel like
how do you feel about your classroom? Not that you have to talk about them or anything, but
illustration, I feel like a lot that I learn is just by out in the world, by experience. It's every job is different. It's basically collaboration between our director and you, or client and you. So you have to just go through it by experience also, because I can tell my own experience with my clients or projects, but the student's gonna go out in the world and I'm sure they're going to have a totally different experiences, and they have to just go by projects. So some of the cases are very hard to teach. I mean,
we had to do a influences presentation at the beginning of this year for our thesis class, and then we had to do a context presentation towards the end of the year. And I found both of the influences one was just mostly confusing, and people talking about what cartoons they watched as a kid. It was like, wow, so we're all nerdy kids that like to draw. But the context presentation was really challenging, and it was a bit alarming to be that challenged by that assignment so close to graduation.
What do you mean context?
What do you mean?
That's what we all wondered. John actually was the first one to go, and I think that your presentation influenced a lot of people because it was like in a positive way. He broke down who he was, and then his kind of educational pathway, and then he did it in circles in terms of how it relates to different people, to how he got to SVA, and how his work is out in the world. So it was supposed to be I think about finding the potential homes for your work. So sort of what you're saying, like we'd kind of created a body of work at this point. So where was it going to go and live? Like who would we hang out with and who would we want to share a studio with? Like things like that. But it was I found it really challenging.
I think it is challenging.
Yeah.
I mean, like I feel like I want to do everything.
Yeah, well, that's
right? And also, like, it's really hard to put yourself in a box at that time.
Yeah.
Because the world is open to you. Like,
Yeah.
why would you have to, like...
But it's also, though, it's like hard to start when the world is so open and there are so many ways to go. I think that was the point of the assignment.
I see.
But what do you think, John?
I think it's a step in the right direction in terms of how we should be thinking about illustration now. Because we were talking about how maybe those traditional revenue streams of illustration are being closed down in terms of getting paid a middle class living to do editorial, essentially, for magazines. Like, that doesn't really exist anymore unless you really hustle. But then there are all these different forms.
Right.
Like, it literally is up to our imagination to, like, create these new things that don't exist yet.
I think...
But I think the pedagogy should, like, have to reflect that somehow. And, like, again, it's, like, a really difficult...
I think the school, by visiting different schools and teaching FIT, faculty seems like they all notice that the editorial is a dying profession, or not dying, but like it's just a small percentage of illustration practice. So I have experience, like a lot of school is now teaching how to be an entrepreneur, or like a different form of like how you can use illustration. And I think that's great. And the student could come up with their own idea, it seems like. And I don't know, I feel like it's going to a good direction in that way. Like being open.
Yeah, I mean, Marcus, what are your students saying in terms of, do they feel lost, or do they feel like they have a pretty clear direction, or they feel...
I think both. I don't really know if anyone had a clear direction. I mean, two of my former students are sitting behind me. But, I mean, and they're doing well. They did really well in my class, and like they were super focused, and et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, a lot of them, I've heard mixed things because I've become friends with former students. And I've heard stories of, there's not enough sort of technical training, like to be taught skills to help them succeed. That it's too much about concept, let's just say, which makes it, entering the industry really obscure, and it creates a lot of uncertainty. So I've heard mixed things, but me personally, I agree with Aya. I think, what's happened, it's really become about entrepreneurship, and to tag off of what Annie was saying, I hate to say it, but branding, and I'm not a branding expert. I don't know anything about that, but, I have a feeling that it's moving in that direction. I don't want to say non-conventional types of assignments, because that would mean that conventional would be editorial or advertising, but because, the landscape's shifted so much, and there's, what we maybe no longer have so much of anymore has been replaced with so many new opportunities. So I think, for me personally, I think it's a really exciting place, and in addition to the students who, so period. Yeah. So I didn't really answer your question, but I do think that, in my classroom, I have students who, do know what they want to do, and those who don't, it's just how it is. I mean, your classmates, I'm sure, are the same, Cynthia, right?
I guess I think it's also just really about where they are in life. Like, you can't really force someone to know where they're trying to go, and I think that's tough. Like, seeing how, how ready they are to have certain conversations, and I think it's definitely a mixed bag of like, knowing, I guess, conceptual and yeah. But yeah, I've also heard mixed things about like it's interesting because like we need to, as illustration students, we need to like balance content and technique, and then I guess it's just a matter of like trying to figure out where you're lacking and where you're trying to improve, and then communicating that.
Yeah.
So Cynthia, hearing what Micah says, it might be about branding and creating a brand. It might be about, yeah. Okay, we'll say that. But encompassing this kind of like multifaceted career that a lot of illustrators have nowadays. When you're faced with the demographic state of like publishing that we covered earlier, where maybe it is like overwhelmingly white, but then you have to present your brand as this type, as an Asian American.
Yeah.
Do you have like some kind of pause about that? Does that make you kind of wary about what you're presenting, or?
I feel like just play to your strengths. Like, it just makes sense to kind of go with what you know. And then if it's about branding, then you just have to present yourself as someone who, has unique experiences and create unique art because of who you are as a person. I feel like that is kind of, relevant in our minds, like how we present ourselves, because again, we're like trying to present ourselves online and things like that. And like, who, how do we want to be viewed as? Like, some people are very successful at like creating like a personality that people know them through online, and just that sort of way.
Yeah, sometimes people are like, "Oh, your art is so Japanese," but I've never had an experience that it was in a negative way, because sometimes my clients come to me because I do what I do, and I don't know if it looks so Japanese or not, but like they want that look. That's why they're coming. So being unique is important, right? And I don't think it never really affected me in like a negative way. Yeah.
I think that like minorities, I think John, you and I are both interested in Asian American just like issues and things like that, and I think it shows in your work. I try to show it in my work, and then it's just like taking what you're passionate about and then just trying to, I guess, just show that. Yeah.
The branding thing, it's so tough because it just feels like and it's like ugh, it feels so
bed buggy.
Yeah, unauthentic, I suppose.
Yeah, it does.
Bed buggy works too. And I guess it's how if that is the reality, which it does sort of feel like it needs to be, or that it is. That's the reality. You are your work, but you're also the person that you're bringing to, meeting different people and that kind of stuff. How to bring up in the classroom, because it's not that far from developing your own story and who you are. I guess it's the translation factor, and like what parts of that are you going to put into the world, and that requires an awareness of the way people view you, and of racism and stereotypes, and that like you're sort of, I don't know how to not be complicit in that stuff just without realizing it, because could you choose not to have your identity, your racial identity or sexual identity be a part of your brand? Like how that's like, can you choose to not put that out there and sort of try to be?
I think so. Yeah, I mean, you can just be wherever you wish to, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I know few illustrator who like chosenly not making art that it's more abstract or it's more general.
Yeah.
So they could, it's for them, I think it's more of from a business stand, like if your work is more general, you get hired more.
Yeah.
Or like if you are doing more simple work that you can finish illustration in 1 hour and not like 5 days,
Yeah.
then it's a more how do you say, like economic, like efficient.
Yeah.
So I know it's, depending on who you are, you can choose like what you
I've
want to
chosen.
do.
Yeah, I've chosen I've chosen to I mean, I try my best to be as transparent as I can be. Obviously, like I don't share everything about myself, but I think, having been closeted for, into my 20s and having come out to my mom in my 30s, I'm technically not even out to my dad, and I'm 41, so I guess what I'm saying is that a lot of, I think this things have sort of like been building up, and as an illustrator, as an artist, I feel like my work, my images is a way allows me a way to express that, and so I have been really conscious and purposeful in expressing my sexual orientation through some of my work, mostly through personal work, but but the way in which I share it through social media, through talking about it, it's also allowed a lot of opportunities for me to work with clients who want that, who, I'm saying the most obvious one, like Out Magazine. I work with them quite a bit. And also in terms of my ethnicity, my work, it's not all of it, but some of it is really sort of deeply rooted in like an Asian aesthetic, because I grew up in a house that had all these Chinese luck calendars, and for a long time, like I didn't want to be Chinese. I wanted to be another skin color, and then after a while, it's like you start to, realize, as Cynthia was saying, you play to your strengths, and sometimes your strengths may have been your weaknesses. And so, over time, I became really, really conscious of wanting to include these parts of myself in my portfolio. And also because I had an agent who told me specifically not to include any sort of queer imagery in my portfolio because I may not, because maybe it might offend a client or it wouldn't get me work. And I was so new, and after thinking about it some more, I was like, that was a really kind of oppressive thing to say to me.
Right, you couldn't imagine saying that to a student,
yeah,
right? So that.
But I understand. I could see her point of view because at the end of the day, it's she's running a business, and if I make money, then she makes money.
Yeah.
So it was about that. So
we're gonna get into some questions. I'm gonna skip to this one. That's kind of what you're already talking about, Marcos. But this question says, Marcos, not seeing yourself in your history lessons and the canon, canon of art history. Outside of New York City, I think students still feel this effect, not seeing themselves in their teachers, etc. Can you offer any insight in navigating that landscape?
oh, geez.
I mean, you kind of addressed it a little bit, how you're saying.
In the beginning, you were talking about you felt the history of illustration was the history of white men.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how do you see yourself in it? Right.
Well, then,
how do you find yourself in it?
Yeah.
Whereas you might have been invisible in the past.
Right.
I think it's I honestly think it's about having conversations like this, showing up to events, not being unafraid to present work in class. That you may feel uncertain about, because again, like there is going to be a moment, there may come a time where you're going to put something up in class and it might offend somebody, but that's awesome because then you can talk about it, and so it's about taking those chances, I think, when you're creating your work, because it might not seem like it's a huge step in terms of changing things, but it's like, it might be a tiny one through accumulation of tiny sort of like moments such as the one that I was mentioning. It could create change and sort of, I don't know, maybe normal's not a right word, but bring about this kind of normalcy, for lack of a better word. And I know, like in my own experience, having given talks in the past, I remember there was a time where I decided to include in my lectures work that described my sexual orientation. And the reason why I decided to continue to do that is because afterwards I had young illustrators from other schools who were queer coming up to me and thanking me and sharing their stories with me. I was like, wow, that is incredible, from all different ethnicities, you know? And I thought that was a really powerful thing. And I thought, wow, there was this one student who also felt, you know, his work was sort of emasculated because of the kinds of work that he wanted to do, really sort of pretty, sort of fashion bent, you know. He decided he didn't want to do that anymore because he didn't fit in, you know. He didn't fit into what was considered, you know, more popular and less sort of feminine work. He decided that he wanted to change it. It's like, but why? You know, if this is who you are and this is what you want to do, then continue to do it. You know, and that's kind of, I guess, like a metaphor, if you don't do it, for just staying quiet and shutting up. You know, and if you do that, then there's going to be no change. So.
Word. So this question's for Cynthia. I've found over the 5 years that I've taught, the desire from students to be freelancers in the traditional markets, editorial, book, advertising, dwindles. I don't know if that's because they feel it's no longer a viable career path, or just interested in other things, or the idea of illustration is linked closer to other things for how, as opposed to how I saw it when I was a student 10 years ago. Maybe Cynthia can talk about her experience and her classmates when it comes to goals. So do you guys see yourselves as freelancers, or do you see yourselves being part of larger institutions? Or
I think a lot of, from what I noticed, at least in Micah, it could be different in other schools. There's a lot of students who want to go into like, visual development's really hot right now, and just like, I think it's also just feels more financially safe to be like employed by someone, like working for like a larger thing. And freelancing can be daunting, I think, also because freelancing just isn't really prevalent in terms of like non-art students. Like a lot of people don't know what that is, I would say, like, or just like don't really understand how that works. Whereas I think, you know, again, like visual development's so hot, and it seems really cool to be working with like big names and working on movies and video games and things that people like to interact with. And like Annie said, like illustration, not everyone knows the entire context of what that is. When I first came to Micah, I didn't either. And so I think that's just a matter of, you know, the influences that they have and what they're exposed to before art school.
I also have a theory that it is tied directly to recovering from the recession.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
totally.
So there, people are actually hiring, and there's a lot of companies that are in startups and things like that. Because I know when I started, nobody was hiring. So you had no choice. You had to be a freelancer because you had to eat. And but yeah, so that's interesting. All right, so moving on to the educational system. So here's a comment about the point about the token students or faculty being the only ones in the room being a substitute for comprehensive diversity initiative is so on point. It can be like, we have the faces, but we'll stop at, we don't know how to interact with you. We don't know how to interact with you in this space. And that filters into so many other aspects of academics, such as mentorship, scholarship offers, encouragement to take on internships and networking opportunities, etc. So here's some follow-up questions to that comment. What are some suggestions for educators to take to be more accountable for implementing inclusion in their classrooms and proactively enforce equity and inclusion? It's more of like, actually, you know, we're talking about codifying some of these things that maybe like a school can actually take measures to. Well, okay, so some more follow-up questions. Do people think that diversity training, quote unquote, should be a requirement in the university setting to help facilitate these conversations? Or something that we can discuss loosely around campus?
Has a burning desire to answer this.
I have I've read about diversity training, but I have no idea what that would entail. Would it entail like the faculty having these conversations, or like
and this awesome video to watch?
Yeah, right. Like, because I feel like that could easily. easily be sort of we're doing diversity training now, so everything is okay.
Right.
But not knowing what it
And
entails.
also, who is training?
Yeah.
I'm worried. Like, who's in charge here?
Right.
Yeah, you can pay me to come troll your institution and talk about these things.
Training, the idea is so broad.
Yeah, it's
Like
true.
students have definitely pushed for it, and it like sounds like a great idea, but then you're like, can that cover everything? Like, how often
Right.
does this have to happen? Like, and then it's just like a matter of like, I think it sounds great, but is it as effective as it sounds?
Because it's not only about the way you speak to someone, it's not all semantics, you know, it's about, it really is something that comes from the inside of a person. Like they need to have this sort of deep relationship with wanting to create this type of environment, because otherwise it's just going to come off as being fake, you know? Then,
Well, I think it's good to, if there's a place that if some problem happens, then faculty can meet up and talk about it, because a lot of the faculties especially in New York, they're all adjunct. They only teach one class and they teach and they go.
Yeah.
So there's no really a communication between with other faculties, to be honest. Like I don't know who to talk to, like if I have some problem, if there's some kind of forum or like some place that I could just freely talk about these things, that would be great.
Yeah, and I know art schools, because they rely so heavily on adjunct professors to function, but a lot of times there's little to no oversight over how people actually conduct their classes. And like even falling into the job, it's like, I started teaching because I was friends with somebody, you know, like, so you get kind of word of mouth and you kind of fall into it. And then there's not a lot of oversight. And then sometimes like that doesn't lend itself to the most, I guess, controlled environment,
Right.
which, you know, can be good in like an art school setting. But when it comes to these really difficult questions, like there has to be some level of centralized conversation where people can go and like, this happened, I don't know what to do,
Right.
like, or why is this happening? I have no idea what these kids are talking about. Where were they going to go to actually figure that out?
that's a big question.
Yeah.
Because it's an institutional thing.
Right.
Yeah.
I feel like a lot of that just emphasis for diversity and like being able to incorporate into classrooms like comes from administration, and like I do feel like sometimes teachers aren't properly equipped for that, and then I've known students who either take to the internet or like make physical outside of classroom critique sessions in order to get that sort of identity-based critique that they're hoping for but don't receive in the classroom. And then that was a big question on that.
Yeah, and again, it's another thing that's outside of the institution of the academy.
You should have school administrators here, because they're probably more apt to answer
Right,
that.
right.
Yeah.
But it sounds like the Micah students are really good at organizing and meeting the needs that they don't feel like Micah is meeting for them. And so perhaps it would be the existence of a committee like the New Visions Committee within the administration that has some structure that the administration can relate to, but can funnel these, because it sounds like you guys are killing it.
Yeah, I think the Micah student leaders are all really great.
Yeah.
I think they are very great at like mobilizing and recognizing what they want from from their education, and I think that's like really important that I think a lot of these things start from the student level. If you feel like you're not receiving the education that you want, like all those protests that we were talking about happening at all those schools across the country, they recognized it, they addressed it, and then their administration is hopefully taking action in order to combat that. So yeah, I think students, if you feel like something's not right, just go for it. Gather your friends and start conversations.
Absolutely. And I think a lot, when it comes down to the administration, I'll play the devil's advocate. They're always going to be talking about money.
Yeah.
But, in large, like say Google, for example, if they don't tackle, quote unquote, the diversity problem, their workforce is going to be diminished. They're going to lose revenue. It has a very tangible effect on their their business. And I'm sure the same can be said about art institutions moving forward. Like if we say that there are so many more Asian students and international students coming, and as the country diversifies and the demographics shift, if you don't know how to tackle this stuff, then there's nobody going to be coming to your schools. So I think that's a looming problem that I think institutions can think about in terms of a very real, tangible effect on their bottom line. Yeah. Okay. So more questions. Richie says, I guess Richie Pope, what's up? Richie, correlations between private art schools versus public universities and that business education or not, you think? What's the question?
Well, I didn't tell you.
That's what Richie said. Richie, call us.
Like, do you see, like,
Call
I
in.
think what he's getting at is, like, there was a discussion about the business and, like, whether you even got a business education at your school. Do you think there's a correlation between a public school versus a private school and whether you're actually going to get those discussions or not?
Oh.
Private institutions. Like he's coming from, I believe RBA is a public institution.
Right.
You guys are at, SBA, all these things. This is very, I don't know Micah, but it's private.
Yeah, there's definitely like
I
classes
think
that
it gets
cover.
lumped into
Yeah.
privilege, really.
Well, yeah. It comes kind of down to when we're talking about socioeconomics. Those are directly tied to race, to gender, to sexual orientation. So if you talk about private art schools, who's going to those schools as opposed to who's going to the public universities too, there's going to be that level of discrepancy, I feel, and then it's just kind of like privilege building upon itself, I suppose. Like, so if a really rich kid goes to a private art college, there's going to be an expectation of him or her, probably him, having to come out of the school and hit the ground running because it's kind of expected of the $100,000, $120,000, $200,000 that they've paid to get into that school. But yeah, I mean, do you have any insights?
FIT is not private, right? It's city college, and I feel like, well, maybe because it's different. Like I'm in MFA program, so it's a little bit different, but they do have how do you say, like sorry, I'm so ESL. They have a benefit of having a very cheap tuition, so they don't end up with a student loan after they graduate. And I realize SVA or any private institution, whoever graduate, they have so much student loan when they graduate, right? And they have to pay off that. So there is a benefit to, I feel like, our program at FIT, that it's very affordable, and we have like help from scholarship and things like that. So I don't know what I was gonna say.
So it helps attract. SVA is kind of skylined in terms of visibility. People know what it is in South Korea. They know what it is in Seoul. There's commercials for it, like in China and stuff like that. Like,
Me too.
Yeah, but one of the things that would draw people to that school was like, oh, I graduated from SVA and I just made it big and I'm huge. I'm Marcus Chen and I'm whatever.
You didn't even go to that.
I'm a huge.
And you're huge.
But say that if you have one rock star that comes out of there, even if they were saddled with $200,000 of debt, they made it, and then
Yeah, it's.
But then it's up to the school to have to
Yeah.
make sure at least one of those people make it out.
Right. And talking about like in such a small community though, people don't usually know illustration has an MFA, degree. I don't know. It's. I don't know if the school name really speaks in that sense.
Maybe, yeah. All right. So last question. Is the market reflecting and supporting our growing set of diverse artists? What about students who are afraid to create a portfolio with mostly African American, Asian characters who are afraid that they won't get work because of that? I often struggle with giving real advice on that issue. My advice is that diversity goes both ways, but I'm curious as to what others think.
I know that when I was first starting out, I specifically did not. I geared my portfolio specifically to ensure that I was getting work. You know, you've heard this phrase, don't create a portfolio that will get you work, create a book that will get you the kind of work that you want, you know. But I created a book. Yeah, I created a book that was rooted in fashion and lifestyle, but I was also creating work that I knew would make me money, you know, because I was making $8.37 an hour. I was sleeping on a sleeping bag on the floor in a living room that I shared, a one-bedroom apartment I shared with my friend. And I just wasn't making enough money, you know, and I wanted to make money. Yeah. I'm being completely honest, you know, I had zero support from my dad paid my rent once in like the early 2000s, like maybe when I was 27. He paid, you know, gave me $400 because I almost missed rent. But, you know, not to be too long-winded about it, you know, back then, I couldn't create the portfolio that I wanted to create because, you know, I was afraid, you know, I was afraid that I couldn't support myself. I was afraid that it wouldn't be successful in, I guess, more of a conventional way or a traditional way, stereotypical way, successful. And I didn't have the confidence, you know, like, yeah, I just didn't have the confidence to create the types of images that I wanted to, because I didn't come from a family who championed me in that capacity. And so it took me, you know, I spent years creating this portfolio that I liked. I enjoyed it, you know, and it's making me money. And I got, you know, I luckily got some, you know, good ad jobs that provided me with more freedom. And it wasn't until 2005 when I moved to New York and then I met Yuko Shimizu and Katie Yamazaki and like a whole bunch of like former graduates from SVA who started to talk about the meaning of work, one's work, and the importance of, you know, one's personal story and personal vision and artistic expression and et cetera, et cetera. Like before that, it didn't even matter to me, you know? And so fortunately, I was at a point financially where I could begin to explore topics that were about, you know, mostly sexual orientation and race. But before that, I couldn't. So, you know, I know that a lot of my students, they want to just like graduate and like, you know, just, you know, run out of the gate or, you know, and just like be sprinting. But it doesn't happen like that for everybody. Right. We all have our own pace and time. And for me, my pace and time was much slower than some of my, you know, colleagues and former students, and I had to wait, and that's just the reality.
I feel like maybe in the school we don't really talk about, we just concentrate in seeing very like 1-2% of the illustrator who are stars and who get out of the school and they just have so much work that they can just live as a freelancer. Like we don't really talk about most of the illustrator who graduate and we all have part-time job or just, you know, doing so many other things to just scrape off and just survive. Like we don't really spotlight and talk about that like in school. I don't.
Well, I feel the exact fear that you're describing, you know, and it's a different time and that fear it's not necessarily justified, but when you are just starting out, it is, you know, creating work that you want to sell. And so it's, you know, less, I find that tendency to be funneled into something. I had a professor tell me that my work needed to be cooler, like that kind of thing. And so it's, you know, he told me to look at more Tumblr
Really?
But you know, so then it's like that voice is yeah, right. So there's that voice. You know, I think that tendency, that fear of like, okay, I understand that work has a bigger meaning, and I do want to tell the story, but I also really want to pay the bills right now. So I'm kind of willing to do whatever it takes.
Right.
And
it's funny though, because I feel like in education, that's like the last thing you say, like, well, go with a trend.
yeah, it wasn't a stellar class, but it made me so mad I kind of pushed against it, which was good. But you know, like that fear, I totally connect with that fear that you're talking about. You know, and I have a completely different background from you, but it's still, I think that's pretty common. I don't know how you feel, Cynthia, that just like all of a sudden school's over and it's like, oh, that freedom that I was just gonna be me and do me is definitely got scary a little.
Well, I mean, like in reality, yeah, you have to do any job that you can get, like to survive, just in New York or wherever you are. So you will get, you know, those jobs that you don't want to do, but that's life, right?
Totally.
But I think that's. I'm sorry.
Well, I guess the argument would be that you make the best work when you're making it about the subject matter that you really like, perhaps, and that pushes you further, and that what you're making doesn't necessarily have to not make money. Especially if it is the best possible work that you're going to be creating. Like, the hope is that that's actually going to draw more people to you, and that's going to give you an edge in terms of your market value, quote unquote.
Yeah, that's. I mean, it's important that you just do your own work, even though you do commercial work. Like the balance between your working on your own work and doing commercial work, you just need to make time and do that. Otherwise, I think a lot of people can get lost or get even bored at doing illustration.
Yeah.
Well, cool. So we're at 3:00. If you have any last parting shots you want to take at anybody, or any issue or anything.
No, just thank you. This has
Yeah,
been
thank
really
you.
great.
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks everybody in the chat. Thanks everyone that's listening. Thank you for all of our guests for donating your time. And yeah, so hopefully we're going to continue the conversation in the next podcast. We'll let you guys know when, where, what that's going to be about. But until next time, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.